Hello and welcome. I am Lucille Isadora Tures, and I am the spiritual director of the Order of the Mystical Christ and the Sophia Wisdom Centers. I want to welcome you to this virtual retreat to get unstuck and give you some of the core concepts and the vocabulary that you'll need to best understand the sessions this weekend. I'll start by introducing myself. I started the spiritual work in Boston almost 20 years ago. And at the time, my life was looking pretty good from the outside, but I was really struggling with knowing myself, feeling authentic, and with symptoms of anxiety and depression. In the beginning, I was really in it for symptom reduction. I wanted to feel better, and I wanted to stop repeating the same cycles in relationships and other parts of my life that were bringing me a lot of pain. And that happened pretty quickly over the first couple years I was doing the work. But then I discovered that there was this incredibly deep and expansive and powerful spiritual world that I could access and that I could continue to learn and grow from. I started to look towards service and helping others. And over 15 years of teaching, I've seen incredible changes in hundreds of students and apprentices that I've worked with. This is just the beginning. These sessions will give you a taste of some of the hermetic, mystical, and metaphysical roots of our teaching and give you some exercises and tools that you can use to start to get unstuck. But I also want you to know that there is an infinitely deep world inside and that it's an adventure that really never ends. Let's start with this PowerPoint to give you some of those concepts, and we'll meet up at the end again and get you started on this incredible journey of self-discovery, of letting go of old patterns, and truly getting unstuck. All right, so this is Introduction to Christian Hermeticism, Magic, and Mysticism by Lucille Isadora Tures. The first question we're addressing is, what are Christian Hermeticism, metaphysics, and mysticism? Metaphysics is the study of the forces and effects of the physical and spiritual worlds. It was the birthplace for the physical sciences, and it's the basis for all spiritual paths that seek to understand how the physical plane is connected to and affected by the spiritual plane. So this is a tricky concept if you haven't heard it before, but metaphysics is really the original science seeking to understand the forces of the earth, but also those which are unseen and spiritual in nature. And so it's where Western science began, but it also continues to this day in the form of understanding spiritual forces and how they affect us in the physical plane. Metaphysics seeks to answer the following questions. How is the physical plane affected by spiritual forces? What does nature and the pattern of the earth tell us about the nature and pattern of God? What do divine revelation and knowledge about the spiritual world tell us about the ultimate purpose of human life and consciousness on earth? These are obviously big questions, and we're not going to answer them today. This is really to give us an idea of the scope of metaphysics. These questions are very deep and cannot be answered solely intellectually. They really have to be combined with experience to be truly understood. And that's a big part of what we do on this spiritual path. Metaphysics was studied all over the world and became the foundation for all ancient knowledge of the world and of the unique spiritual capacity of human beings. It's the root of ancient wisdom teachings from Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as many native shamanic traditions. These traditions developed separately for the most part, but arrived at very similar core truths and spiritual realities. So in the East, some of the deep metaphysics revolved around understanding the way energy moves, prana, breath, chakras, and various ways of healing both energetically and physically. In the West, they came to really similar understandings, but with a whole different cultural perspective. And at some point during the 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, there was some communication between these paths where there was more integration of the Eastern words, languaging, and perspective into the Western metaphysics. So now we're moving to Christian Hermeticism. Hermeticism is one of the metaphysical traditions that was born in the West and which developed out of ancient Egyptian wisdom and the philosophical traditions of the Greco-Roman Empire. So there was already a grounding in these truth seekers and proto-scientists. And then Jesus' appearance on earth and his manifestation of the superhuman consciousness and capacities shifted the Hermetic tradition into a Christian form. So much like those sort of wise men in the story of the Nativity, these were wise people that were attuned to the cosmic realities, and they recognized the pattern of Jesus, his consciousness, his action, his teachings, as having fulfilled a question that was open in the field of metaphysics and Christian Hermeticism, which is, what does it look like to be a fully evolved human being? What does it look like if we reach the full capacity of the human potential? The Hermetics, who had been seeking and discovering deep spiritual realities for centuries, recognized Jesus not only as an avatar and savior, but also as a representation of the full human capacity. Jesus' words are the basis for Christian Hermeticism. In John 14 it says, "Of all these things I do, so shall you do, and greater than these," which is a huge statement cosmically, right? That he is saying that the potential for spiritual development and the works that he did, which he specifically refers to, which means the way that he interacts with nature, and this mastery over physical form, is something that we all have the capacity to do, and that we're helped in that process via his intervention of grace. The major questions that Christian Hermeticism sought to answer are, by what process did Jesus, as a human being, become able to channel the reality of God so completely? What do Jesus' teachings and actions tell us about our own spiritual and physical capacity? And by what means and processes can we most effectively follow in his footsteps and achieve high levels of spiritual transformation, consciousness, and power? These are really the questions of how do we actively engage in the fulfillment of Jesus' words? How do we actively engage in our own spiritual evolution towards Christ consciousness? And how do we gather up the materials and the forms and the wisdom and the processes to do that? Christian mysticism and Christian Hermeticism overlap a great deal, but they represent two aspects of spiritual discovery. Mysticism tends to focus on the devotional and feeling aspects of the work towards Christhood, i.e., unity with God, while Hermeticism tends to focus on the more intellectual aspects of the transformation process. So mysticism is really the process of seeking union with God, seeking direct experience of God, being in states of shared consciousness with the high vibrational consciousness of the divine. So mysticism sometimes also includes an intellectual aspect, but it's sometimes worked through church structures or other spiritual means to access that direct experience of God, Jesus and Mary, by which they were transformed. So sometimes there is a esoteric process in a Christian mystical or hermetic group that really seeks to combine both the experiential and the practical and intellectual aspects of this development. But there are also mystics who really did that process completely through devotional work, through seeking and finding that connection to the divine consciousness and just selling off every other part of their life for it, sacrificing everything for more of that. And by that, they were transformed into what the church would call saints, mystical saints. So the ultimate goal of each of these traditions is to develop Christ consciousness in union with God. That's where it's all going, and that's what it's all about. So now we're going to talk about the Dark Ages and hidden forms, how these teachings ended up taking the form that they're currently in. The Dark Ages brought the extreme oppression of alternate forms of Christianity. So it was only a few hundred years after Jesus' life that the church got settled into a dogmatic form and then began the descent into the Dark Ages. It was really, interestingly, with Constantine changing the whole Greco-Roman Empire into Christians by force, by decree, and really solidifying the political structure of the church that this descent began. And then for about 1,000 years, the Catholic Church, which was the only official Christian church at the time, Protestantism didn't come for till much later, sought to destroy any Christian forms and practices that did not align with their own dogma. Many people were murdered, and texts and alternative spiritual groups were destroyed. This oppression was pretty extreme and was very extreme in certain periods, but the goal was really to make one Christianity with one set of rules, one church, and one dogma. And the Catholic Church at the time found it reasonable to do that by any means necessary and was threatened by any alternative forms of Christianity. So the Christian Hermetics had to go underground to protect their teachings and practices from annihilation. This led to the formation of secret groups and orders who hid the teachings in coded texts within the occult, which means hidden organizations. So this creates this formation of these secret societies, which had to function with a lot of layers of disguises externally and in the texts and teaching themselves. They functioned often with a lot of initiatory processes, which kept people from being able to spy on them, essentially, and discover what they were doing, turn them into the church, and have them destroyed. So now the teachings go underground, and then they develop underground for 1,000 years. And this is a period where there is some communication between different forms of metaphysics and mysticism, East and West. And eventually also a deep connection with Jewish mysticism called Kabbalah, partially because there was overlap in understanding and wisdom, and partially because the Jewish form was not as scrutinized by the church, and therefore coding the teachings into Kabbalic forms, which ended up being a kind of Christian Kabbalah, was a way to keep the teachings without making them vulnerable to the persecutions of the church. So this developed into secret traditions like alchemy, tarot, and the practice of magic. I do want to touch on magic as well. So magic here is really used to describe the spiritual process of transformation, the way that subtle forces like mind, emotions, consciousness, intention, and spirit affect physical properties of life, including our own bodies and the world around us. All of these things took on other meanings because they were hidden. So the word occult means hidden. Mysticism is actually about direct experience of God. Esotericism, right? These all came to mean in the English language mysterious, dark, and possibly suspicious. But that's not really their original intent or meaning, and we're returning to those original meanings. So the emergence. During the Enlightenment period of history, these traditions and practices were brought to light. Because of the secret nature of these groups and traditions, however, they were not well understood. Despite the more liberal mindset of the Enlightenment period, there was still a great deal of fear about the devil and dark forces, which was a huge focus of the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages. And so his huge focus of society. There was a lot of fear about anything different, about any forms of spirituality that were not strictly adherent to the Catholic Church at the time. And there was also a lot of talk about demons and darkness and possession and this claiming of a fear of dark forces acting all the time. So all this stuff, when it came out, had a little bit of fear around it, that maybe it was that stuff, which the culture was sort of moving past and out of an obsession with, but it still had that tinge to it. So it still has an association in the Enlightenment period of being possibly dark and evil. And of course, there are people who were trying to use it that way, because anytime there's something powerful, there are people who try to use it to abuse and control other people. And so those people gave magic and esotericism and the occult a bad name. So these misunderstandings kind of carried through and stayed in the group mind over hundreds of years. So again, magic is the application of subtle forces to affect physical forms. This is primarily a spiritual form that was intended and understood as such by the Hermetics. The reason why we're using these terms, even though they're kind of loaded now, is because they're meaningful and they need to be reclaimed. So mysticism can mean in the English language now something not understood or dark or magical, but it has a specific meaning, and Hermeticism has a real meaning uniquely, and as does metaphysics, as does magic. So we're going to return to the true forms of these words and reclaim them. So we practice modern Hermeticism, metaphysics, and mysticism. Hopefully, from what I've described, you have a sense of what that means now. So the Order of the Mystical Christ and Sophia Wisdom Centers are a modern form of ancient traditions and patterns. Our teachings come through a line of teachers and aspirants that originate in the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Rosicrucians, which were two of the fundamental esoteric Christian Hermetic orders that carried teachings through the Dark Ages. We have not only carried on and adapted the teachings to modern science and society, but we've also carried forward the actual initiations and spiritual practices that bring those teachings alive. This is much more rare. There are a lot of places that you can find the text, the books from the Rosicrucians, or lots of people who interpreted them or had ideas about them, but the actual processes of transformation and initiation, how the alchemy actually works now, is something that has largely been lost or has stopped being practiced. So we're carrying both those things, both the modern transmutation of the teachings, because the teachings were always meant to coincide with and be in harmony with science. And so in order to have that be true, they have to be updated with current science. And current science actually reinforces and supports a lot of the core teachings of the Christian Hermetics and mysticism and metaphysics in a way that Newtonian science never could. So not only have we updated, but it's actually elevated it in its harmonious relationship with the physical sciences. So we are a modern Hermetic, metaphysical, mystical Christian order. And that's a lot of words. So we usually just call ourselves mystical, because the devotional piece is something that is core to our work, the actual building of the relationship. And so we often identify primarily as a mystical order, but we are also Hermetic and metaphysical. Our order provides direct apprenticeship with Christian mystical master teachers, priests, and ministers. So a direct student-teacher relationship, a direct apprenticeship, where you are taken individually, looked at for where you are spiritually, what your current obstacles are, and put along a specific and focused path of spiritual awakening, transformation, and ultimately service. We have Christian mystical initiations, which are pure forms created through ancient traditions, which have been brought into the modern state, intact and also somewhat adjusted to the current psyche of the human race. We're a modern Hermetic community, so the community aspect, which is really important. We work together. We support one another, and we create an environment in which it becomes socially normal to do this work, to focus on your soul, to focus on the transformation of your consciousness. This is really not valued in our culture. We live in a capitalistic culture that values acquisition. So having a community that shares consciousness really feeds and nourishes our individual work. And we build communities both in person and through online communities to help every member be supported at all levels. And we have powerful sacramental forms and rites, which are vessels for deep spiritual knowledge communicated in these symbolic and energetic forms, which are incredibly powerful. And I encourage you to experience them through some of the most accessible ones, like our mystical communion. So that's it for this talk. If you want more information, you can visit us at sophiawisdom.org. You can write us an email, visit us on Facebook, and ask any questions you have. And also you can find either brick and mortar center near you or how to join our online community. Also, we have complete online courses through our website, which are profound and a good way to get started with the teachings and get exposure to how we teach, how we approach things, who we are, etc. So we look forward to meeting all of you someday. So hopefully that was helpful, but if you still feel confused about some of these ideas and concepts, don't worry about it. You can go back and listen again, or you can just kind of roll with it and you'll pick things up as you go. Enjoy this incredible retreat and the wonderful speakers you'll be hearing.